Hi, everybody. I'm pleased to welcome you to this month's edition of The Political Ledger. I'm Jenni McIsaac, Chief Experience Officer at Canaccord Genuity. Now, The Political Ledger is a new monthly video series and webcast. And really, we've designed the series to provide expert insight and perspective into the intersection of politics, the economy, and business, especially based on the backdrop of our increasingly complex political landscape. Now, each month, I'm going to be joined by Rod Phillips to my left. Rod is Canaccord Genuity Corp's Vice Chairman, former Ontario Minister of Finance, and current chair of Toronto Global. Now, each month, Rod is going to be joined by notable guests, and he will lead conversation into really what's going on in the world of politics in that given day, week, or month. This month and today, we're going to dig into the upcoming political election that's been called for the end of April. Rod, welcome.
Thank you, Jenny. We're really looking forward to this. We'll look forward to hearing any ideas people have as well about what will be interesting, but certainly interesting times we're living in.
Exactly. So, Rod, I'm going to cue you up with a few questions now, get the conversation going. But just to everybody who's live, please submit questions if you have them in the chat bot at the bottom of your screen. So, Rod, just to set the context here, obviously, Prime Minister Mark Carney on Sunday announced that on April 28th, we're going to be hosting we're slated for a Canadian federal election. Many people are calling this sort of the most consequential of our time. And so can you just, for everybody listening, sort of set the context for the election and really the state of our three major political parties and their leaders?
So, Jenny, for every politician, they always say every election is the most important because it is for them, because it's about their job. But I think this is really a case with the backdrop, and I know we're going to talk about it, of what's going on with our neighbors to the south, what's going on in the country, what's going on in the world, that this really is likely the most consequential election, at least potentially the most consequential election in our lifetimes. Right now, if the election was today, what the polls would tell us is that Mark Carney would be the prime minister and likely a majority government, which is a remarkable story in itself. The Conservative Party under Pierre Poilievre, which has been 2 months ago, would have been saying the same things, that they would be forming the government, I think is trying to find its footing and change the agenda and the conversation. And the NDP, who are always very important in politics in Canada, in part because of what they talk about, but also because of what they do in terms of the votes that the Liberals and the Conservatives don't get, are struggling in a way that they haven't struggled in a generation. So it's a very interesting time, very consequential time, and each of the parties faces their own challenges for the next number of days.
Now, let's just start on the Liberal side and Mark Carney. To your point, the Liberals were in a very different situation 6 months ago, as were the Conservatives. Talk to me about, Mark Carney's background, the Liberal Party policies, and, what they're facing in the next 4 weeks in this election trail.
Yeah, so the story of Mark Carney and his political rise is really a remarkable one. I once said to him that, if we had a search committee and a search firm to pick a prime minister of Canada, you'd likely be the kind of person that we picked. But it wasn't in a good way. It was in a way of saying that that's not the way politics tends to work. Yet with his rise, I think we can't underestimate what the effect of Justin Trudeau leaving and the anger that came out of the system simultaneously, when some legitimate concern, even bordering on fear for a lot of people, and Mr. Carney came in at that time with the image of a problem solver, of an experienced individual, a steady hand at the wheel. When we talk about the Conservatives and Pierre Poilievre, he was channeling a lot of the anger and frustration that particularly younger Canadians, who typically haven't voted Conservative, but are or were focused on that. But he was channeling a lot of that anger and angst that people were feeling about 10 years of Liberal government, which, a lot of people would have said has not put us in the strongest place we could be. And what happened was that anger now seems somewhat misplaced. Because if people are angry at anybody, they're angry at Donald Trump south of the border. Yep. And so I think that's where the Conservatives are trying to still focus and harness that argument. In terms of Jagmeet Singh, Singh has always been playing a risky game, which was propping up a minority Liberal government. Almost always in parliamentary democracies, that doesn't work out well for the people who propped up the minority government, because the government takes all the credit for the things that are good and nobody remembers, all the bad things. They go, well, why did you prop those guys up? So a lot of people would say, and I would agree, that Singh misplayed his cards by never bringing down the Trudeau government And the fact that Trudeau, in effect, did that on his own, although it was really his own party that threw him out, has now left him as a bystander in this very consequential conversation. So people, I think, are going to be asking, how would Pierre Poilievre deal with Trump and the issues we're facing? And how would Mark Carney deal with them? I don't think anybody's right now wondering about Jagmeet Singh, which is a bad place for them to be.
Now, you've brought up Trump. No question. The Trump administration, the proposed tariffs will be the biggest ballot question of this election. Talk to me about what you think about Trump's approach with Canada over the last, month too.
So I've never met him myself, but I know a number of people who have. And what has resonated in my experience about the sort of person is people who come out of the development industry and development space. And he is, after all, many things. He was a celebrity host of a very popular TV show. He did a lot of things in his life, but at the core, he's been a developer in one of the most aggressive real estate markets in the world, New York. And that strategy from a development perspective is often, you're going to let me build 40 stories. I need 80 stories. The world's going to end and I get 60. So we both won, or I won. They also tend to look at things, and I don't want to typify, but they tend to look at each project has to win in its own right. It isn't necessarily about the longer term, bigger picture. It's this, this development, this thing I'm focusing on. I will win or I will lose. I will get what I need or I won't get what I need. The third thing I'd observe, and I've seen it in politics, I've seen it in business, in a lot of things, but when people have something and they lose it and then get it back, they often have a much more determined approach, whether that's in business. If you've seen people who've been successful and then had a down, but they come back, a lot of people assume they're going to be the way they were. In politics in particular, politicians who won and lost and then win again often come back in a much more determined way. So I think we're seeing someone who's very determined to do what he wants to do, someone who does tend to look at things in a zero-sum fashion, and someone who's used to demanding whatever he needs to get what he wants.
Interesting.
And trying to differentiate needs and wants. I think that's going to be the job of the new government, figuring out how much he has to get.
Interesting. Now, talk to me about how Trump and those proposed tariffs are going to play into this election race.
Well, that is, when we talk about this being consequential, there have been many important elections. Often people go back to 1988, which was a discussion about free trade and a pretty pivotal election. But if you just compare, that election, for those who recall it, and this one, that was more of a theoretical discussion about what might happen. What's going to be different about this election is, assuming that things go forward and there are tariffs on April 2nd, in real time, these things will be impacting people. This isn't going to be, is it a good idea? This is going to be, there's a 25% tariff, and within 10 to 12 days, based on what people, for instance, in the auto sector are saying, we could see hundreds of thousands of people in Ontario not working, plants closing, hopefully temporarily. How does that affect the dynamic of an election? Am I more likely to think that the prime minister is a good guy because my neighbor or, my neighbor's neighbor or myself just lost my job, but he's fighting for me? Or am I going to blame him for, how did you call an election when we're in the middle of these things? Nobody knows. But the parties are going to have to be reactive to that. So I think the major event will be that tariff decision and what actually happens. Of course, Donald Trump on any given day can decide to involve himself in the election. For all we know, the vice president he's in Greenland now, apparently. He might fly to, he might stop in Newfoundland and, meet with the leader of the Green Party. Who knows, right? So the potential for there to be extraneous events, which from a campaign point of view is challenging, because you try to plan your campaign. And of course, there are the debates in the middle of April, where presumably there'll be a crescendo of all these things happening, and one or the other leader's ability to focus on what will likely be one of the best viewed Canadian political debates. Not typically, me and my friends like to watch them, but typically most of the people who are watching this podcast wouldn't be marking in their calendar, I can't wait to watch that debate. But I think you'll probably have millions of Canadians tuning in. So there's going to be some events, and obviously what goes on, and in a real visceral way, what goes on, with the aluminum tariffs. We're already starting to see closures, particularly in Quebec. And will people care? Obviously, the people being affected will care. Will other people care, and how will that affect their vote?
Now, knowing, the conservative and Poilievre approach, knowing the liberal and Carney approach, talk to me about how you think they're going to navigate, the complexity of Trump and, to your point, externalities that might enter.
So if the ballot question, and then ballot question for folks who don't follow politics, is just a simplified way of thinking about what every political campaign is about, which is if I'm running a campaign and Jenni's running a campaign, and we will both have different versions of what we would like people to be thinking when they go in the ballot box. That would be the ballot question. And right now, and then sometimes, even though you have a campaign, the ballot question just is what it is. Right. So right now, the ballot question that Mark Carney would like, because he clearly wins on that, is who's best to deal with Donald Trump. And that question, as it stands, tends to him, which is why if there's an election today, the polls say he would win. Pierre Poilievre, the ballot question was about affordability, about change, time for a change. It was about who's going to make the changes in the country that are going to make life better for me. And to the extent people are thinking about that, Pierre Poilievre is the superior candidate. The challenge right now for anybody is that sometimes you don't get to choose. It just is what it is. We watched a provincial election in Ontario just now where Doug Ford and his team made the question about, this is about Trump and fighting Trump. And in that context, he was the superior candidate. And by the way, as premier, he got to fly to Washington a couple of times and actually do the job while he's doing it. If we compare that, Bonnie Crombie's team said it's about healthcare. Now, everybody would say healthcare is really important, but trust me, very few people were voting on healthcare. So that definition, I think there's a really high probability that it's outside the ability of either campaign to change it. All these dynamics are going to affect things. But if you aren't talking about what people want to hear about, you better be very compelling.
Yep.
And so when we get to that debate, which will be a focal point, one imagines that they're both going to be trying to prove that they are the better person to handle Trump. Poilievre, perhaps from the perspective of, I'm going to fix all these problems, and you can't trust him to do that. And these problems are why we have a problem with Trump. Yeah. And Carney going, oh, my Rolodex, look, Donald Trump, I've met him, and who's more likely to be successful.
Just a reminder to folks who are listening in, if you have any questions, submit them in the question box at the bottom. I can see here a few questions have come in. So Rod, I'm just going to pull some of these into the conversation. The first, what's your opinion of Doug Ford connecting with Carney, and is that troublesome to the Conservative Party?
Absolutely. Listen, Doug Ford, who I had the privilege of working with as his finance minister, is not a particularly partisan guy. That's his appeal. He does other things well, but he's not someone who particularly is really focused on conservative or liberal or NDP. So it didn't surprise me at all when the day after Carney was elected, the first call that Carney wanted to make was to the premier, who is also right now the chair of the Council of the Federation, which is a sort of somewhat informal group which premiers take different turns being chair, but Doug is the chair of it right now. And so the affinity, Ontario, if you think about the election, and we can talk about the different parts of the ridings, but Ontario is critical to either government. Neither side can really form the government without winning in Ontario. And having the now 3-term very popular premier of Ontario, who's just literally been putting on his Canada's not for sale hat, sitting down with the new prime minister in a conveniently located little diner in Etobicoke, to talk like two ordinary guys. Well, of course, there's all these cameras focused on inevitably helped start to solidify Carney into his role as maybe the captain of Team Canada. Or maybe the co-captain. I mean, Doug would probably argue he's captain too.
And so just to dig into that, how does Poilievre respond to that?
Well, you saw he responded by phoning the premier to talk to him for the first time since Poilievre's been leader and the premier had been reelected. And I think talking to him and wanting to not only have that conversation, and we all don't know what happened in the conversation, although it's been widely reported, so we could speculate, but try to tap into a little bit of that. Yep. I mean, this, Ford is in a way it's reminiscent, if you will, of early COVID, when he really captured the angst of folks and was on TV every day telling us whether we could get our hair cut or not. And I used to stand behind him and wonder what the answer was going to be. That was my job then. But he did that. But his, he has captured the spirit of a lot of people's combination of anger, disappointment, and fear relative. And so any politician would want to graft onto that. And so Poilievre needs to try to do that too. But clearly is it a bit of a disadvantage because he decided, you don't want to make a friend when you need a friend. It's better to make a friend earlier.
Makes sense. So just switching gears a little bit, beyond party platforms, what do you see as sort of the key economic vulnerabilities of Canadian business leaders in the context of this election?
The obvious piece is that we are a fully integrated economy in many, many factors, and that it's been part of the excellence of Canadian, American, and Mexican business to figure out how to make this work, to make in a highly competitive industry like autos, but not only autos, to build our products in a way that they can compete globally, and we have world-class products. The breaking up of that arbitrarily is going to be ugly. It's like, if the system didn't run so well, it wouldn't be such a problem.
Yeah.
But because it's been so well designed and run so well, the immediate effects. I speak to people, particularly in the auto sector, but any of the advanced manufacturing sectors. These are businesses that run on very tight margins, right? What I've been told and what they've talked about as well in the public is, many of their customers across the border have said, well, if there's a 25% tariff, I need a 25% price cut that day. Well, when you're running a 5 or 8% margin business, how long do you want to run at a loss? And, do I really want to run up my line of credit, just to keep it open for another 2 weeks? So of course, people have been advanced shipping as many parts as they can.
Yep.
But the projections from people that I trust say 1 to 2 weeks, there's no reason for that business to be operating anymore, which will basically grind to a halt. So those are the immediate effects. But I think on the broader scale, things like energy, other places that are very import dependent, what we all have to recall as well is just how much American investment is in Canadian. So it's not just about Canadian and American businesses. It's actual American investment in parts of our oil and gas industry and other things. So this is, quite disruptive across a number of features. You mentioned I'm the chair of Toronto Global. That's the organization that's tasked with bringing foreign direct investment to the GTA. This has been a very robust place, the Greater Toronto Area, for business to have an access point. We have a great market here, 7 million people. You want to be here, but you also want to be here to be able to access the United States. But now, how much does that make sense? So I think it has put a real pause on things. I also think that's effect on the other side of the border. But what you also see in the American sense, there was just a big announcement for over $20 billion of investment from Honda. So you've got CEOs lining up to go to Mar-a-Lago and say, I'm going to bring, just 10 billion. That can't be enough. Bring 20, right? And so whether those projects will manifest themselves in real reshoring of industry and plants, we'll wait and see. But that kind of enthusiasm we haven't been seeing in Canada.
Interesting. Okay, we're going to go to another question here. Okay, back to the provinces. What role do you see the provinces playing in this federal race? Are there regional dynamics or policy flashpoints we should be paying closer attention to?
Yeah. So if we try to think to the medium and long term, there's all these things that are going to happen in the short term. But by far the biggest risk right now, and Norman Spector wrote about this the other day, a former cabinet secretary, is what's happening in Alberta. So we don't know what's going to happen, but one can imagine a scenario, as I said, if there was an election today, that Mark Carney would get a majority government, not well representative of Alberta and Saskatchewan, who less so Premier Moe, but the Premier of Alberta in particular, has been very aggressive in her mind defending her province's rights about what has to be the case, and literally said if that isn't clear, and I don't get what I need to make my province viable, then within 6 months, we're going to seriously think about our relationship with the country. So that's a big deal, right? And we always, we put ourselves in the shoes of folks. She is dealing with a province that has felt very unfairly treated, and I would say objectively has been very unfairly treated by this existing Liberal government. Yeah. Mark Carney has made some commitments that would make you feel perhaps better about that. But the chances are that, Alberta, the chance of Alberta feeling alienated and hard done by and feeling they need to do something along the lines of what they talked about 2 years ago, which was taking their pension plan out of play. But there are other steps they could take. Yeah. So I think that provincial dynamic is important to watch. Quebec will be critical to the election right now. How well the Bloc does versus how well the Liberals do, but the Liberals are doing quite well. They're doing very well in the Maritimes. So if as the votes get counted on the 28th, if crossing that Ottawa border, the Ottawa River border, the Liberals already have 70 or 80 seats, then they're on their way doing pretty well.
Yep.
right? And so that dynamic will be affected by a number of things. But I think we'll see. You can always tell a lot, and if you just want to do a little micro study in any day of what a campaign's doing, look where they're sending their leader. So Mark Carney started out on the East Coast, firming up that vote. Poilievre went straight to GTA. Has to do well there, and we'll watch how people spend their time, and that'll tell us where the strategy is going.
Interesting. Next question that's come in, getting back to Carney and the Liberals, do you have an understanding or perspective on how influential Carney was on the Liberal government over the last 10 years, probably more so behind the scenes?
Yeah, I think there is a narrative which is true, which is that he was a financial advisor or providing financial advice to the federal Liberal government. I think there were probably segments of policy where he was important, but I think it always has to be careful about overstating how important anybody outside of government is.
Yeah.
I think Justin Trudeau, Chrystia Freeland, the people who were in charge were in charge. And I'm sure Mark Carney could get his calls returned because he's Mark Carney,
Yep.
but he had another job. I think there was obviously a lot of alignment on the zero carbon agenda, and that very much played into his roles at the United Nations, at Brookfield, and otherwise. So one would imagine on that they were aligned, but I don't think he was writing the budget.
Makes sense. Next up here, Rod, given your extensive experience in both the private sector and government, what qualities do you think are essential for the next generation of political leaders in Canada to effectively address our evolving economic and political challenges?
So I have a particular preference on this, which is I really think it's great. And we have a lot of great younger people. If I looked across the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party, a lot of folks in their 30s, early 40s, even some in their 20s, who are really impressive, motivated, visionary folks. I think some experience outside of government is super helpful. And I say that, I came to government pretty late in my 50s, so that might just be me talking my own book. But I actually think it helps. The flip side of that is, like any profession, the more you do it, the better you get. So if you were to look at most of the leaders over the last 20 years in Canada in politics, and literally I can name the ones that this is not true for, that's how small the number is, almost all of them were one way or another a professional politician. And some of them are surprising, like a guy like Mike Harris, who I think was a good premier, but really Mike Harris was in politics. Stephen Harper, he started on the Conservative side of the ledger, really was in different versions of politics.
Yep.
As a staffer and things in his life. He's in business now, obviously, Prime Minister Harper. Justin Trudeau, Jean Chrétien, right? Like most of the people who lead are kind of Kathleen Wynne, right? There are some anomalies, guys like Doug Ford. One of the reasons I like Doug as a leader is because he actually had to meet a payroll. Right. He had a business here. He opened a business in the States. He opened two businesses in the States. One worked, one didn't. That's a different kind of experience. So I really encourage those people that are keen about politics to take some chance to get some other opportunity, because I think it makes them more well-rounded. But there is a reality, and I could go on, Jason Kenney, like there's just a group of people that Justin Trudeau, right, who literally, that's what they do.
Interesting.
And Pierre Poilievre would fit in that category. So he's not surprisingly very good at politics.
Yep.
And I think that's very important. It's a risk to being Mark Carney and not knowing anything about politics in that traditional sense, but it is helpful to any role to have a bit more diverse opinion.
Makes sense. Let's see here. What is the biggest sticking points you see when it comes to reducing interprovincial barriers to trade? Is it realistic to assume we could get free trade within Canada?
It is, but whenever something hasn't happened for a long time, it's funny when you were a new minister, because I was Minister of Finance and Environment, long-term care. So when they first come into the job as a political person, there's usually something that the bureaucrats put on your desk. And I'm a big fan of the civil service, so I don't say that in the bad way of bureaucrats, but here's the really important thing that needs to be done. And the first question you have to ask, well, if it's really important, then why didn't the last 5 ministers do it? There must be some reason, and there's usually a good reason. And that might be the reason you should do it, but it probably is the reason you should at least wonder. So it's not that people haven't been having this conversation for a long time. The underlying reason why things stay the way they are is because there's more interests aligned to them staying the way they are than changing.
Yep.
And because for the people who the system works for, and I could name some of the stakeholders if we want to get micro about it, but they have a real interest in things staying that way. And as soon as anybody thinks those things could change, they're very effective at saying all the bad things that will happen. And so that's not any different today than it was before. It's great to see Premier Ford in his role talk about changes. Many of those things are Ontario based. And so you have to be facing a different problem.
Interesting.
And I think we are facing a different problem, but it is in no way that these things can't be reconciled. But it will involve a level of cooperation at the provincial level that can sometimes be difficult to engender. And you have to lay that across the various risks. Again, we talked about Alberta. You know, I happened to take over as finance minister near the end of the discussion of a national securities regulator. And I brought in securities regulation changes in Ontario and just said, if everybody else wants to do it, that's what we're doing. But that was a really good idea, but it didn't get done in the time frame. And by the time we got to the point where I was looking at it, you know, Alberta wasn't happy about this, Quebec wasn't happy about that. So everybody just went, we had to do it. So hopefully we're in a period where we can get that kind of alignment. And certainly each of Pierre Poilievre and Mark Carney have talked about driving it, but people forget about Canada. This is a federation, which means the provinces are actually just as important in the law as the federal government. So the federal government can't, in certain areas of jurisdiction, the federal government can just decide to do things. But in some areas of jurisdictions, only the provinces can do this. So you really need alignment around that from all the levels of government. Entirely possible. And I'm optimistic, but all those interests are still all those interests.
Okay. Now, I've been waiting for this one to come in through the line. Who do you think will win?
If there was an election today, I think Carney would win, but we have never had an election with so much volatility. You know, what happens when there are, you know, 300,000 to 500,000 people not working that were working at the beginning of the election? And as I said, do they feel now I really need Mark Carney to protect me? Or do they feel like I don't believe that Mark Carney wasn't protecting me? Does that even happen? Does the April 2nd pass and they say it's going to be May 2nd, right? At which point, you know, because the Premier of Alberta went in the media and said that she'd asked Trump's government to delay it so Poilievre could get elected, then everybody's going to go like, oh my God, is this all somebody, you know, plunking for Poilievre? So I don't know. And I think at this stage, one of the things to do is watch the trends. And if you were watching the trend lines, they're very distinctly going in a direction which is seeing the Liberal fortunes improve. The last set of polls I saw the Liberals at 45%. I think you might have to go back to Justin Trudeau's father to go to a time when the Liberal Party actually was polling at 45%. Now, that might sound great, but the election isn't for, you know, several weeks. And we saw what happened with Pierre Poilievre. If the election had been 2 months ago, he'd be prime minister. Who knows what the situation will be a month from now? As they say, a week is a lifetime in politics. So we'll have to see.
We'll have to see.
Yeah.
This is something we haven't touched on. What policy areas do you think are being overlooked in the campaign, but could be major elements of post-election?
Well, I think that national unity file that pops up from time to time, I'm not sure it's being overlooked, but I think there's a lot of simmering angst. And I think having spent a bit of time in Alberta recently, we shouldn't underestimate the depth of that. So I think that's probably the major one. There is, of course, the reaction to the tariffs, but this is not the reaction to what do we do to support people. And I know work is being done at the provincial and the federal levels about this. So if we do have people out of work, and if you actually believe there could be a reshoring of manufacturing or other businesses into the United States, how are governments going to deal with that? Conversation of retraining and support and others. The whole idea of the interprovincial trade barriers. I also think outreach into other markets. I mean, almost as long as we've been talking about getting rid of interprovincial trade barriers, we've been talking about trading not just with the United States, but with other countries.
Yeah.
The interesting thing that we're finding now, again, the Toronto Global role gives me a bit of perspective on this, is there is suddenly more interest. There's sort of a common cause issue with European and even particularly South Asian places where, again, we've had some political arguments and disagreements with countries like India and China. But I think everybody is also seeing the opportunity because Canada is a good place to do business with. I mean, people like to do business with people you trust. Yep. And by and large, globally, we're seen as the victims here. I don't think that's good for us. I don't think we should think of ourselves as victims. I think we should, put ourselves in a stronger position. But I think there's an opportunity to think about that.
Yep. Makes sense. Now, you referenced a few minutes ago the debates in a few weeks. We had a question come in around them. What should the business community be listening for during the leaders' debate? Are there particular cues or commitments that could be especially telling?
It's a great question. So I think different for different people. We'll focus mostly on Carney and Polyev, but I will talk about Singh a little bit as well because he's going to matter. I think for Carney, if you were to think about the traditional ways we think about Canadian politics, he would be into that business liberal, blue liberal. If I were to say a name, Paul Martin, that kind of, although to be fair, Paul Martin had a lot more business experience than Mark Carney. I mean, Mark Carney has essentially been a very, very senior bureaucrat most of his life, last few years at Brookfield, but not in operating roles. Where, to give credit to Paul Martin, he actually ran and built businesses. But that solidifying of those things, particularly on what he is framed as conventional energy, right? There seems to be a consensus that pipelines, other things are going to be very important, exploiting our mineral resources and using those correctly. So I think the business community should want to hear from Carney real commitments they can trust. He absolutely got rid of the carbon tax, except what he actually did was just reduce it to zero. So it still exists, right? So there are a group of people who'd like it to be gone because that would be different than I turned the dial down. And I think given the strength of his previous commitments on those issues related to zero carbon, to the extent that the business community believes in the resource future, they should focus on that. For Polyev, I mean, this is, Pierre Polyev has a very deep and sophisticated set of ideas that are very much free market, very much free enterprise, very much freedom oriented. And I think his articulation of those and the confidence that he gives people that he will follow through on them. Because, there is also an underlying sense from a lot of business people that there are just systems in the country that need to be broken and rebuilt. How we approve things. Like, why does it cost more to build a kilometer of subway here than it does in Paris or London?
Yeah.
Right. Like that seems kind of crazy. And I think the strength, but the things you'd want to hear from is what does he specifically want to do there? Because I think, whether or not it's the right positioning with people's level of anxiety about Trump to get elected, we'll see. But there's a lot of people with a sentiment that there's just fundamental problems. And Polyev has been pretty clear. He sees that. From Carney, it's almost like I can adjust the dials. He wants a whole new machine.
Yep.
And it'll be interesting to see how comfortable and confident people feel in both those explanations. And at the end of the day, we all that spend enough time, even to spend your time, thank you, on a podcast like this, we intellectualize politics way more than most voters. Most voters, 20% of it is what they think, and 80% of it is how they feel. And it's always worth remembering. It's one of the reasons why sometimes they say in a political debate, turn the sound off and just look and see what you see. And if there's someone who you feel you're more comfortable with, half the time that's going to be enough to make people vote for that person.
Rod, I'm going to pause us there. We're just past the half hour. Thank you to everybody who submitted questions. Rod, thank you for joining. Just to set up what we're going to be focused on next month, we're going to be live days before the election. Rod's actually going to be joined by a leading Canadian pollster, getting into the insights of sort of what's going to be unfolding over the next 4 weeks. So look forward to picking up next month's episode of the Political Ledger then. Thank you.
Thank you. And please, in the comments, any topics or areas you're interested in, we're interested in what you're interested in.